Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a special Valentine's Day edition of the Q&A Lunch with Jason Killeen. Today, we'll be going over the annual licensing process just briefly before we hop into your questions. So without further ado, I just wanted to do a little bit of information about the annual licensing process, upcoming deadlines, the process for non-retail annual licenses, retail annual licenses, and then some of the associated fees that have not been assessed yet. So the annual licensing process is a multi-step procedure that can take up to 120 days from the date we issue a notice of complete application. There's a bunch of different concurrent deadlines for both DCR and applicants. Specifically, there are deadlines associated with the retail storefront activity because we have to conduct a community meeting as well as a public hearing. Because there's deadlines at the state level for folks to get their final environmental report, we are prioritizing processing the annual license applications for folks that have first provisional license deadlines in July, then in August, and then moving forward. And then as you see with our phasing chart later in the presentation, we've created capacity in the upcoming months to start sprinkling in folks that don't actually have existing provisional state licenses. Our goal is to process as many of the annual license applications for folks that have temporary approval and a state provisional license to avoid any interruption in the operations of the licensees, given the upcoming state license deadlines. So our prioritization is based on when the state provisional license expiration dates will occur. As folks know, DCR issued draft notices of exemption to licensees that had temporary approval on or after July 1st, 2023, and will continue to issue those for folks through June 30th of 2024. But beginning on July 1st of 2024, in order to renew a state license, you're going to need to have met the requirements for a state annual license. And in order to do that, you have to have an adopted environmental report, which means that you have to have completed the local annual license process. So the state has given us basically an aging report that tells DCR when provisional licenses will be expiring on or after July 1st of 2024, so that we can prioritize processing those annual license applications to reduce the risk of operational stoppages associated with not having both a local and an annual state license. Separate and apart from the state expiration dates, we are prioritizing the social equity businesses that don't have a state provisional license. Those are folks that don't have the ability to operate, whether they're non-retail or they're retail storefront applicants. For the state, with the implementation of SB 51, there may be an opportunity for social equity applicants to get new provisional retail storefront provisional licenses, but we're still waiting for more information from the state in terms of how that's going to play out and whether or not those businesses would be eligible to get fee deferrals or fee waivers through the LJAG funding because they do get a state provisional license. And then, of course, we'll be processing all of their businesses on a first come, first served basis. So in January of 2024, we began to issue the first notices of complete application. We started with 16 applicants who had applied for the retail storefront and microbusiness with on-site sales activities. This formally began their annual license application process and the 90-day period for DCR to make a recommendation to the Cannabis Regulation Commission. Since the annual licensing process for non-retail businesses is simpler, they just go to the director for approval. We're beginning to review those applications and issue notices of complete application this month. For businesses that have both the retail and non-retail activities, your notices of complete application will go out on the same date. But however, your retail storefront will go on one processing pipeline, and then the non-retail activities will go on a different processing pipeline. We're not going to slow down the processing of the non-retail in order just to wait for the cannabis regulation to take up your annual license application. For the non-retail businesses, once you've received your notice of complete application, we will send you an electronic notification that the application has been complete, and it'll have specific information related to your application. we will either grant or deny the annual license within 90 days. If DCR approves the issuance of an annual license, as part of that determination, the director will either adopt the environmental findings for us to support a notice of exemption or some other environmental report associated with your project. If a notice of exemption is determined for your project, DCR will go ahead and file that NOE with the county clerk to reduce the appeal period for that environmental document from 180 days down to 35 days. This is just an example template of what those notices of complete application look like. As you can see on the template, it'll have your record number, the proposed business premises address, the council district, neighborhood council, the closest bid if applicable, the community plan area, what the applicant's name is, and what activities are associated with the record. For folks that had licenses in 2023, you've seen that we've bifurcated the retail storefront into one record type, and then all of the other activities are in a different record type so that the retail storefront, of course, can move forward to the commission, and then everything else can move forward to the director for approval. Hopping into the annual licensing process for the retail storefront businesses, this has a lot more deadlines because DCR is required to conduct a community meeting, and then we also have to present our findings through a public hearing before the Cannabis Regulation Commission. So one of the first steps is once we've noticed that your application is deemed complete, within 10 days, we have to send out electronic notifications to the council office, the neighborhood council, the applicant, and others to notify them that the application has been deemed complete. Within 10 days of getting that notification, the applicant needs to reach out to the neighborhood council in which their business premises is located to offer to meet with the neighborhood council or to present their project. The neighborhood council does not have to schedule you prior to DCR making a recommendation to issue an annual license. And if you're unable to attend the community meeting or you've already been issued the annual license prior to them being able to schedule you, that will not impact the recommendation DCR makes as it relates to your project. Separately, within 45 days of the applicant receiving a notice of complete application, DCR has to conduct a community meeting. We're going to be doing all of our community meetings virtually. When we send out our notice of complete application, we have to notice the community meeting at least 20 days prior to a community meeting. Separately, we also have to transmit our report for Cannabis Regulation Commission consideration within 90 days. Prior to having the public hearing, there is a required 20-day notice for that public hearing. So what DCR is doing to be as cost-effective as possible for applicants is we've created a proposed schedule. So we know when we determine a application complete, when we're going to conduct the community meeting for that application, and when we're going to conduct the public hearing for that application. So we're going to notice the community meeting and the public hearing at the same time. So when we send you information, it will have both the proposed community meeting date as well as the proposed public hearing date. And because we're noticing those two dates, we need to be able to stick to that calendar. Community meetings will be conducted on Thursdays. And then, of course, our Cannabis Regulation Commissions regularly meet at 2 p.m. on the first and third Thursdays of every month. Other than July 4th, and then for the winter holiday break, we anticipate that beginning in April, the Cannabis Regulation Commission will be taking up multiple annual license retail storefront applications on a biweekly basis at each of those committees or commission meetings. So I'm going to kind of jump into a little bit of what the notice is going to look like. Of course, once the cannabis regulation has adopted the findings, they'll be able to adopt the environmental report. If your project qualifies for a notice of exemption, we will go down and file that notice of exemption to reduce the appeal period from 180 days down to 35 days. And then following that 35-day appeal period, we will be able to issue an annual license. Separately, when we file the notices of exemption, We are transmitting those findings to the state so that the state can begin to finalize your annual state license application, so that once that appeal period has run, within 30 days of that, the state thinks that they'll be able to issue you the state annual license. This is what our proposed hearing calendar looks like for the retail storefront activities. We've already deemed the first 33 records complete. 16 of those records have been transmitted to GSD. Department of General Services is sending all of the required mail notice out. All of those notices will be mailed out on or before February 23rd, 2024. We've already seen the first set of notices start to be received by stakeholders. The first community meeting will be held on March 14th. And then DCR has until March 29th, 2024 to transmit our recommendation to the Cannabis Regulation Commission. And then, of course, the Cannabis Regulation Commission will take up the first cases on April 4th. Building on the calendar, where you see the color-coded bars, that's going to really be our first opportunity to fold people in that don't have current state provisional licenses. And we'll do that on a first come, first served basis, and also based on the social equity status of the application. We're hoping to have all of the retail storefronts that have active state provisional licenses deemed complete before June 30th of 2024. And then that basically frees up the calendar for the remainder of the year to focus on businesses that have no active state provisional license. If we're successful in deeming all 300 of those applications complete before June 30th of this year, we'll be able to issue annual licenses for all of them before the end of the calendar year, which means that folks won't have to worry about running up against any of the state's 2025 deadlines. But it also means that folks that don't have state provisional licenses will also have an opportunity within the second half of the year to get through the annual licensing process and potentially get before the commission before 2025. DCR has to provide different types of notice as it relates to the retail storefront records. So above and beyond the email notification to various parties, we also have to post that notice on our website. So under the licensing tab, you'll see a section dedicated to public notice. There's a section dedicated solely to a notice of complete application determination as required by code. It's 10406B. And on that web page, you'll see the name of the applicant, their associated record number, the proposed premises address, the activity, council district, the community plan area, the date that we're going to be that we issued our notice of complete application, when we have the virtual community meeting scheduled, and then you can use the little scroll bar to go to the right. You'll also see the Cannabis Regulation Commission date. So again, once we deem the application complete, it's frozen in time, no modifications to the record, because we have a strict processing time frame to make our recommendation to the commission and to get through all of the required processes. Separately, this is a template of what our mailed notice looks like. The Department of General Services is doing the mailed notice on behalf of the Department of Cannabis Regulation. So we're filling out this template. It's a two-sided mailer. And on the mailer, it's got the information for owners and occupants within 700 feet of the business premises location. It's got all of the relevant information required by the municipal code. It also provides information about the community meeting date as well as the public hearing date. So we're providing notice all at once, which meets the minimum requirement of the municipal code, which says that notice has to be provided at least 20 days prior to the community meeting and the Cannabis Regulation Commission meeting. So folks and stakeholders should be starting to receive these notices for the first 16 businesses that have been deemed complete. And then we'll be transmitting within the next week and a half to General Services the second batch of 17 folks. Additionally, the applicant is going to be required to post notice at the business premises location. We will be sending out the templates directly to the applicants for them to print and post at the business premises location. The information that's posted is required by the municipal code. It has to be in at least 20-point font. It has to provide the information about the community meeting date as well as the public hearing date. And again, this will be a template that DCR populates on behalf of the applicant. It will be electronically mailed to the applicant. The applicant will be responsible for printing it and posting it at the business premises location, similar to the way that folks that are applying for alcohol licenses will post the notifications on the window. So given the fact that we're not doing the first set of community meetings until March 8th, you don't have to worry if you're one of the first 16 that haven't received this yet. We anticipate that we will be mailing these templates or emailing these templates to you sometime next week. Lastly, getting into some of the fees that folks will either be assessed for, get a notification that they're deferred, or have their fees waived depending on their circumstance. In addition to the annual licensing application fees, there's fees associated with the environmental review, the categorical exemption, or other type of environmental review, the publication fee for the notice that has to be given and filing the notices of exemption, the written notice, the mailed notice, the community meeting, the Cannabis Regulation Committee meeting. We're hoping that for folks that have active state provisional licenses, we'll be able to waive the majority, if not all of these fees. We have submitted a request to the Department of Cannabis Control to utilize the local jurisdiction assistance grant monies to waive these fees because they're all tied into the environmental review process, which is necessary to get your local annual license. The state has weighed in that the categorical exemption fee, they believe we will be able to waive, but they're working with their legal counsel on the other fees. So for now, for the folks that have their applications deemed complete, we will be deferring these fees until we get final guidance from the state on which fees can be waived. If you do not have a state provisional license, DCR is not allowed to utilize the LJAG funds to waive any of your fees or to process your application. So you will be invoiced for those corresponding fees. They will have to be paid prior to you moving forward. And with that, that ends the formal presentation so we can hop into the questions.
Hi, Jason. I'm hoping you can hear me okay.
Loud and clear.
Awesome. Okay, we'll start off with our first question. Steve B. What is the status of the CEQA determinations for phase 2 applicants submitted last year?
So DCR is still processing the phase 2 annual license applications. We are beginning to deem some of those phase 2 applications complete. Depending on what type of phase 2 application it is, there may be additional steps the applicant has to take. For instance, the tier 1 and tier 2 applicants, those are the bona fide social equity applicants. They had to have completed their equity share review prior to their application being deemed complete. And then for the tier 3 applicants, they're going to have to submit their social equity agreement prior to their application being deemed complete. So depending on what circumstance you're in, the analysts will be reaching out to folks, get an email notification about what tier is currently associated with your phase 2 application and whether or not there's additional steps you have to complete prior to having your application deemed complete. But for the large part, we've already drafted notices of exemption for the phase 2 applicants because those were existing businesses. And a lot of them, of course, are located at a location that may qualify as an infill project. So the Class 1 and the Class 32 exemptions will most likely apply to those projects. As part of the renewal process, we did request that folks submit the updated 4013 form that the state is going to be requiring to go along with those environmental determinations. So to the extent that a record was timely renewed, the updated 4013 form was submitted in its entirety. You should be on track to get your notice of complete application later this year.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question from Juan G is, what are the distancing requirements for parks, schools, and other recreational facilities to establish my small business?
So the distancing requirements are going to be based on the activity that you're applying for. So I would recommend that you go to the DCR website and you look at the information and procedure bulletin for the pre-application review process. Retail storefront applicants have to be outside of a 700-foot radius of schools, public parks, public libraries, alcoholism or drug and abuse recovery or treatment facilities, daycare centers, and permanent supportive housing projects with on-site services. For all other commercial cannabis activities, they have to be at least outside of a 600-foot radius of a school. So it's going to depend on what activity you plan to apply for. And then, of course, there is information on the website to provide additional information as it relates to your application or your proposed application.
Steve B asks, when do you anticipate phase 2 non-retailer annual applications will be processed?
The first sets of notices of complete application are going out this month. And we do have outside legal counsel reviewing the environmental findings prior to us transmitting them to the director for approval in her review. So I anticipate later this month or early next month at the latest, the first set of phase 2 annual licenses will be adopted and we'll file the NOEs. And then annual licenses should begin to be issued probably in March or April.
Thank you, Jason. Dongyu Y asks, can anyone apply for a social equity store as long as you secure a location?
The applicant entity has to be verified as a social equity business, which means that one or more verified social equity individual applicants have to have an aggregate ownership stake in the applicant entity to qualify for social equity processing. So if you've been verified and you're applying with an entity that meets the requirements under Municipal Code Section 1020, then you do have the opportunity to submit a social equity application for commercial cannabis activity. If you have not been verified, then you'll have to wait until the verification period reopens for you to go ahead and try to get verified as an individual.
Doug W asks, once we have our annual license, what other requirements are needed for the operating permit?
So this is a really good question. So prior to the amendments that were made last year to allow us to break up our annual licensing process to meet the state deadlines, folks had to pass a final inspection before they were eligible to get their annual license. What we've done now is the director and the Cannabis Regulation Commission can make a determination and adopt the environmental findings before the applicant is required to have passed their final inspection with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. What that means is, in order to request the final inspection, you have to demonstrate that you've met all of your permit, clearance, license, and other authorizations required by law. So like your certificate of occupancy for your location has to match with the activities that are occurring at the location. At a minimum, you're going to have to get a health permit for your commercial cannabis activities. And then you may need fire permits. You may need to get other permits from the Department of Building and Safety for your activities. And you can't request a final inspection until you've met all of those requirements. And then, of course, once you pass your final inspection, we'll issue an operating permit. For businesses that are eligible to have temporary approval or renew their temporary approval, they can continue operating with their temporary approval in either their state provisional license or their state annual license. But for all other businesses, you'll have to get your operating permit before you can begin to lawfully operate.
Thank you. The next question comes from two individuals, Doug W. and Chris C. What's the deadline for social equity cultivation to have a certificate of occupancy? And what's the deadline for the health permit?
So if a business is operating, you should have one, have your certificate of occupancy squared away, as well as have all of your other necessary permits, because the agencies that are responsible for issuing those documents and making those determinations could find that you're non-compliant. if you're operating without the requirements. For the certificate of occupancy, ultimately you're going to need that in order to get your operating permit, and the fire department may require you to have an active certificate of occupancy for the activity before issuing the fire permit. You will need to have that before you can get your health permit. So all of those things are interrelated, and hopefully businesses have all of the necessary permits from those other agencies before they begin to operate. But we can move forward with your annual license application before those requirements are met based on the amendment to the municipal code made last year that allows us to make the discretionary determination, which is whether or not you are eligible to be issued a commercial cannabis license. And then you can continue working with those agencies to get your C of O and your permits, and then you can request your final inspection and get your operating permit from DCR. For existing operators, there are timeframes articulated in the municipal code that by date certain, you have to have your health permit, you have to have your emblem, and I would just refer you back to the DCR website and the municipal code for those specific dates tied to those specific activities.
Brandon B has two questions. Is there going to be another lottery for retail storefront licensing? And the second question is there a license needed to market my brand, flower in dispensaries?
So we're hopeful that we'll be able to conduct another lottery later this year. If you're just marketing or branding, there's not a specific license that the city issues. However, if you're cultivating, manufacturing, distributing product under your brand, you do need the corresponding commercial cannabis license. And of course, if you're selling branded flower in a dispensary, you'll need a commercial cannabis license.
Our next question from Chris C. Besides being cited by Building and Safety, can a social equity cultivation licensee wait until 2025 to get a health permit and change of use?
It's best to get into those processes as early as possible, because if you have to get building permits, you have to update the certificate of occupancy. That could delay you being able to get the fire permit, and it will definitely delay your ability to qualify for the health permit. So you can't wait to get into the pipeline and hope to complete all of those things at once. You'll have to get into the pipeline with building and safety as early as possible, because until you've met their requirements, you're not going to be able to meet all of the other permitting requirements from the fire department and the health department, et cetera. And that puts you in a situation where you may not be eligible to renew your local license to operate, which means you may have to shut down until you meet all of the operating requirements and get your operating permit.
Our next question comes from Dana Lee C. Please explain how the emblem program fits into the annual license process. Licensees are told by public health they need a certificate of occupancy first. What is being done by DCR to help the process of COO?
So the emblem is something that the County Department of Public Health issues to retail storefront businesses to signify that the location is fully licensed and permitted to engage in retail storefront commercial cannabis activity. The county issues an emblem to applicable businesses once the business has been issued their corresponding health permit, and that's one of the last things to be issued. Public health needs to make sure that you've met all of your local permitting requirements. Do you have approval by the Department of Cannabis Regulation? Do you have the appropriate certificate of occupancy through the Building and Safety Department? Fire permits if applicable, other permits if applicable. DCR can refer you to the Department of Building and Safety if you need assistance in updating the certificate of occupancy for your location. as part of Mayor Bass's Executive Director 4, she is encouraging all of the economic development related departments to work more closely. And our director has been working with the superintendent of building to create a platform for small businesses to get additional assistance for understanding what their permitting requirements are through the Department of Building and Safety. And we're going to be happy to be rolling out one, a webinar on that issue, and then two, additional information on those services in the coming months.
Our next question is also related. It comes from Michael M. We are going through the process of getting our building permits and certificate of occupancy from LADBS. Will this not being completed in time inhibit us from obtaining an annual license? In the past, DCR has accepted proof of process underway. Will that scenario be a possibility?
That scenario is a possibility. As I mentioned in a few of the earlier questions, our director, Michelle, has worked closely with the mayor and city council to amend the Los Angeles Municipal Code to better support our applicants. And one of those changes was allowing for DCR to process an annual license application without the business having to have all of their permits, certificate of occupancy, et cetera, from the departments, from other departments outside of DCR's purview. So that allows for us to focus just on your annual license application and whether or not you meet the requirement for licensure. And then once we've already made that determination, then you have to demonstrate that you have your permits, your certificate of occupancy, et cetera, before you're eligible for a final inspection and to receive your operating permit. So, to get to a notice of complete application, we will accept that proof that the process is underway. That won't inhibit us from issuing an annual license, but you will have to get all of that squared away before you qualify for a final inspection and before you're eligible to receive your operating permit. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Jason. The next question comes from Karen P. What happens next with provisional licenses?
For the most part, the state has stopped issuing new provisional licenses. The one exception is Senate Bill 51, which went into effect January 1st, does give the Department of Cannabis Control the authority to issue new provisional licenses to social equity businesses applying for the retail activity, whether it's retail storefront or non-storefront delivery. Other than that, the state is not issuing any new provisional licenses at this time. And the state is phasing out all of the existing state provisional licenses. So they've given us an aging report so that we can prioritize processing the annual license applications for the folks that are no longer eligible to renew a state provisional license so that we can complete the local process in hopes of them being able to get their state annual license without having any operational impact.
Okay, our next question from Brandy D. How does the process work for annual applications to come to neighborhood councils?
So the annual applications themselves do not go through neighborhood councils. Within 10 days of DCR issuing a notice of complete application, the applicant needs to reach out to the neighborhood council and offer to meet with them or to present at a meeting. So they could send an email to the neighborhood council saying, hey, I'm an applicant for a commercial cannabis retail storefront business. My application was deemed complete. If you'd like to meet with us, let me know. We can, come and meet with you during one of your neighborhood council meetings. Written evidence, such as an email of making that offer, meets the requirements for the code. Or, if you do present before the neighborhood council, a copy of those meeting minutes would also suffice. But the neighborhood council themselves has no role in the actual processing of the annual license application. DCR determines that an application is complete. From there, it starts a 90-day clock for us to process the annual license application and to make a recommendation to either deny or approve the issuance of an annual license. For the retail storefront activities, we have to do a community meeting within 45 days. The neighborhood council and their members are welcome to join the neighborhood or the community meeting and provide input. And then from there, once we've done the community meeting, we summarize the community meeting minutes and the information that was provided at the community meeting into the report that gets presented before the Cannabis Regulation Commission at the public hearing. And if a neighborhood council wanted to participate in the public hearing before the Cannabis Regulation Commission, they're welcome to. They don't have to, and their participation will not impact our ability to issue an annual license.
The next question also comes from Brandy D and asks, what if the applicant does not fulfill community meeting and or neighborhood council requirements within the 10-day prescribed time?
It may delay the processing of the annual license application. From a bureaucratic standpoint, these applications are before us. So if they fail to satisfy that requirement, we can kick it back to the application processing, and then, assuming that nothing has changed on the proposed project, deem it complete again, and then now start the clock. But it would be a failure to provide written notice to the neighborhood council that could kick one of these projects back to us. But the cure would be for us to review the application again, deem it complete, and then for them to do the mandatory notice or provide the evidence that they contacted the local neighborhood council and offered to meet with them.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question, I'm sorry, did you need to continue?
Yeah, just before we hop into that, I do want folks to know that as part of the electronic notifications that DCR sends out, we do send them to the applicable neighborhood council. Even though DCR is notifying the neighborhood councils that the application has been deemed complete, the applicant does have the responsibility to reach out to the neighborhood council and offer to schedule a meeting with them, and that's it. But for applicants, don't assume that the notice DCR sends satisfies your notice requirement, because it doesn't. And then for members of the public, it's not like the neighborhood council doesn't know when the applications are deemed complete, because DCR sends a notice to the council office as well as the neighborhood council.
Thanks, Jason. Sorry to cut you off there. Our next question comes from Alexis L. When will I'm sorry, getting tongue-tied. Let me try that one more time. When will we be able to break up our social equity applicants 51% so we can raise capital?
So the code was amended last year to allow social equity individual applicants to aggregate their equity interest in the applicant to meet the 51% requirement. So if you have an individual who has 51%, they can sell equity to other verified social equity individual applicants so that they can raise capital, but also still meet the requirements of 10420. If you're asking about when a social equity business could fall below the requirements of 10420, there's nothing in the municipal code right now that would allow for the business to fall below the thresholds set by 10420.
Our next question comes from Allie R. When will MySequa be completed and sent to the state for distro and type 6 licenses?
Within 120 days of you receiving a notice of complete application. If you have an existing state provisional license and you reach out to your analyst, we can look to see when your provisional license is set to expire and what tranche of applications we anticipate processing your application in to meet those deadlines. If you don't have a state provisional license currently, we anticipate that the first sets of applications that don't have a provisional deadline will be completed sometime in May if they haven't already been deemed complete.
Our next question from Tobias E. As a social equity applicant, do I qualify to open a grow or open a storefront cannabis dispensary?
DCR is not currently accepting cultivation applications, so you would not be able to apply for any of the cultivation activities other than nursery if you're a verified social equity individual applicant, or the cultivation processor if you are a verified social equity individual applicant. For the retail storefront license types, you had to have been identified in phase 3 retail round 1 or phase 3 retail round 2 in order to submit an application for that activity type. If you haven't been selected, there may be an opportunity for you to get verified again in 2024 and or participate in a lottery process later in 2024.
Our next question comes from Maria C. How long does a phase 1 have now to do any license modification, and when will that ability resume again to phase 1 applicants?
So realistically, we want to lock in the annual license applications so we can deem them complete and then move them forward for further processing. So once we've noticed that an application is complete, you're not allowed to make any modifications to the record until an annual license has been issued. For folks that haven't gotten to a notice of complete application, if you submit a modification request, it will delay our ability to deem the application complete, which could result in you losing your ability to operate because we're not able to process your application prior to the expiration of your state provisional license. So folks that are thinking about modifying their records at this point are going to have to make a business decision about whether the modification is relevant to their current operation and whether or not the processing of that modification, if it results in a delay in getting an annual license, which means that you can't get your state annual license, whether or not you can weather the storm to have to shutter your doors for that period of time. But again, once we've issued a notice of complete application, you are not eligible to submit a modification on that record until an annual license is issued.
Our next question comes from Tim A. I am an applicant in phase 3 retail round 1, opening my doors for business later this year. Once I've completed build out, pass my inspection, and pay any applicable fees, are there any additional steps I need to take now that DCR has for DCR to transition over to the annual license process?
All of the temporary approval application records were migrated over to the annual license application process. So your record should already have a suffix of ANN if you've submitted the application. And that means it's in our annual license application process. If you were eligible to receive temporary approval, once you've completed the build out, you pass the initial inspection and you pay the applicable standard inspection fees, you would be eligible to get temporary approval. If you don't have a state provisional license at this time, when we process your annual license application, you will be responsible for paying the associated fees that I had put up on the screen previously as part of the presentation for all of the environmental, the community meetings, etc., because the DCR is unable to use local jurisdiction assistance grant monies to either defer and or waive those fees. So there would be additional steps if you don't have a state provisional license that will require you to meet the annual licensing application requirements and pay the applicable fees in order to have a notice of complete application and then move forward in the annual licensing process.
Our next question from Rabin W. How many opportunities do we have to open retail locations as someone that's already been awarded retail in 2019?
So each of phase 3 retail round 1 and phase 3 retail round 2, if you were selected to participate in that process, that application opportunity gives you the ability to apply for one retail storefront license. So if you've already been awarded a retail storefront license as part of phase 3 retail round 1, you can't get a second retail storefront license as part of phase 3 retail round 1. However, the city does allow for people to have up to 3 retail storefront locations. So if you were deemed eligible and you got a license as part of phase 3 retail round 1, you were selected in the lottery and you got a license in phase 3 retail round 2, when we open the next lottery process, you would be able to apply for that lottery so that you could be an owner of a third license.
Our next question from Rafi S asks, I want to transfer my cultivation license to a different community plan area. How can I find out if the CPA is available or reached undue concentration? And secondly, what is the process to transfer cultivation to a different CPA?
So on the DCR website, we do have the undue concentration information posted. It's on the same page as the licensing map. So if you scroll down below the licensing map, you'll see information about undue concentration. Within that embedded table, there's one tab that has the retail storefront information. There's a second tab that has the cultivation information. So if you click on cultivation, it'll tell you which CPAs have reached undue concentration. For requesting a relocation of temporary approval to a different CPA, you can only do that through a modification process and into a CPA that has not reached undue concentration. And I would recommend you just reach out to your assigned analyst for more information on that process if the community plan area you'd like to relocate to has not reached undue concentration.
A question from Jorge T. What is the current estimated timeframe between the pre-application submission and when an annual license is granted, given that there isn't a delay on the applicant's part?
For retail storefront applications, the quickest it can be processed is 6 to 12 months if everything is processed in lockstep with each of the different requirements. E.g., you submit the record, pay the fee quickly, it gets processed, and then if it's deemed eligible for further processing, you submit your application, get everything in, you've got your legal business entity record squared away and all of those documents, you've paid the applicable fees so that we can get you into the rest of the process. And then for all of the other activities, it's at least 3 to 6 months if you have everything in order.
A follow-up question from Jorge. Does DCR plan on bringing temporary approval licenses with the passage of SB 51?
So SB 51 doesn't actually impact the city in and of itself. It just gives the Department of Cannabis Control, the state agency, the ability to grant new provisional licenses to social equity applicants pursuing the retail activity. Locally, council at the end of last calendar year granted DCR the authority to grant temporary approval to the same individuals within our annual license process. So once you get your local compliance underway, if you're able to get your state provisional license, DCR would be in a position to allow for you to apply for the temporary approval as part of your annual license application. And if you pass the initial inspection, you could get granted temporary approval before your annual license is deemed complete.
Jorge T asks, the sensitive use map doesn't seem accurate. When will the map be updated?
The sensitive use data is updated on a quarterly basis. So new data was pulled February 1st of 2024, and the new sensitive use layers were rendered yesterday. So the sensitive use information posted on the map today is up to date. The only thing that's missing right now is the current layers for the retail storefront applications, licenses, and pre-applications, which will be updated by the end of the week. We're rendering that data right now.
Thank you, Jason. Olin F asks, I'm interested in starting a dispensary with an equity grant. Where do I begin from scratch?
If you're not currently in the process, I would recommend that you reach out to dcr.sep@lacity.org. If you are a verified social equity individual applicant, they have various resources that they could refer you to if you're looking to start a dispensary.
A follow-up question from Olin. The current website links to the city site that has no registration login for new users. What is the current URL?
Without knowing what website is being referred to, cannabis.lacity.gov is the department's website. Our DCR licensing portal is an Excel-hosted solution that you can link to from the DCR website, or folks may be able to drop a link to the licensing portal where you could register for an individual user account within the DCR licensing portal. So I'm not 100% sure what website they're referring to or what they're trying to register for.
Thanks, Jason. Our next question comes from Johannes V. I would like to find out the latest deadline for clearance of CEQA for the right to operate my store license. I would also like to know if there are any additional procedures to complete after CEQA is cleared by city, state.
So the adoption of an annual license ties to the adoption of the findings incorporated within the environmental report. So until either the director or the Cannabis Regulation Commission have adopted your environmental report, you don't have a final environmental document as it relates to CEQA, and we don't have the ability to file a notice of exemption with the county clerk. So your getting a final CEQA document will correlate directly to the issuance of an annual license, because at that point, the decision maker will have made a determination to issue an annual license. The appeal period for the environmental document will have passed, and you'll have already received your local annual license. For folks that have a state provisional license, there is an aging report that relates to when your state provisional license will expire, and we're prioritizing the processing of the local annual license applications to meet those state deadlines. And then in terms of procedures, for folks that have provisional licenses, one or more of the fees that would otherwise be due may be eligible for deferral or waiver utilizing the local jurisdiction assistance grant monies. If you don't have an active state provisional license, you will be required to pay the associated application environmental review noticing fees as it relates to your specific record.
Jason, I wanted to check on your time. It is 12:57.
I will go as long as I can until somebody asks me to finish the Q&A and go to my next meeting. So normally
Okay.
I have at least a 5 or 10 minute like grace period before somebody's knocking on the door.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. Let's see, Johannes V. Is there no set deadline for, if there is no set deadline for clearance of CEQA, could there be a possibility to obtain a temporary permit to operate the store?
It depends. You won't be able to operate without a local license and a state license. So if your business has temporary approval, but you don't have a state license, you won't be able to operate until you have temporary approval and a state annual license. If you don't have temporary approval, but you're applying for the retail storefront activity and your social equity applicant, there could be a pathway for you to get your state annual license, which you complete the local annual licensing process. And then once you demonstrate you have the corresponding state annual license, be eligible for an initial inspection and to go through and get temporary approval at that time. For folks that aren't going to be able to get a state provisional license and they're not a social equity applicant eligible for temporary approval, you'll have to go through the local annual license process, get your state annual license, meet all of your permitting requirements, get your health permit, true up the certificate of occupancy, pass a final inspection, and then once you receive your operating permit, you would be able to operate. So it really depends on the type of application record and what type of license or licenses you may have been issued. Otherwise, you may have to wait until you have both a state annual license and a local operating permit in order to begin operating your business.
Javier R. asks, how long does the land use review process take?
Generally, it's within 30 days of the pre-application being deemed filed. Pre-application is deemed filed once we have all of the documentation and the applicable fees have been paid, deferred, or waived. But if you have a balance on your account and we haven't deferred the fees and or waived the fees, it's not considered filed yet.
Javier also has this question. What is the deadline for phase 3, round 1?
It's kind of an open-ended question. The city has already identified which applicants are eligible to participate in phase 3 retail round 1. Applications as part of that process have already received their local compliance underway notification or been abandoned. And then abandoned records may be refiled one time. And then if that secondary record is deemed abandoned, you no longer have an opportunity to apply as part of this process. So with us transitioning to annual licensing application, at this point, you may have a record get deemed abandoned, and then you have up to 3 years from the date that it's abandoned, as long as it was abandoned after January 1st of 2022 to refile. So if you've already been abandoned, you're eligible to refile. Your record may time out as early as January 1st of 2025, or it would be 3 years from the date that you received your notice of abandoned application.
Thank you. Our next question from Ivan D. When will the PCN program open?
Sometime later this year. The PCN process takes about 6 months to complete. And for the folks that initiated the PCN process in fall of 2023, we've transmitted all of the eligible records to the city clerk for council consideration already. And council has until April 14th to make determinations on those existing records. We don't like to have overlapping PCN processing timelines because it messes with the calculations for sensitive uses. So it would be sometime after mid-April would be the earliest it could open up. Generally, we like to open up the process right after we've updated the sensitive uses for the quarter so that we can get through the pre-application review process, figure out which locations are potentially eligible under 105. So either May or August would likely be the timing for reopening PCN filing. And then, we'll give you as much advance notice as possible prior to opening up PCN filing process.
Let's see, Ivan D. How much time will applicants have to find a compliant property before it closes?
But it's going to be based, assuming that this is an expansion of the earlier question about the PCN process, whatever the PCN filing period is, you'll have until the filing period closes to submit a pre-application request for a proposed business premises location. It could be 2 weeks, it could be 4 weeks, it could be 6 weeks, it could be 8 weeks. You don't have to have site control and active lease or anything else to meet the requirements for having a pre-application record deemed filed. You just have to have the owner attestation submitted as part of your pre-application record. And then once the pre-application is deemed eligible for further processing or eligible for processing, you have up to 1 year from that date to submit your actual application.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question from Levon E. I believe I see some discrepancies in the DCR map of licensed retailers and pending applications because I see locations on the map that aren't used for dispensaries. Is the LA DCR map accurate?
So the retail storefront layers were deleted yesterday because we're in the process of updating them with information through mid-February. So those will be posted. When we post on the website, the DCR licensing map is kind of a tool for prospective applicants to look to see whether or not there's a sensitive use or a retail storefront business that could impact their proposed location. And it's really there for informational purposes only. If we see a location on the map as we're doing our land use review, we review the information and the record details behind it. So the map will have information that may not create a buffer for pre-application review purposes. There's more information there than the entire universe of what actually would either be deemed a sensitive use or an active application that could buffer somebody out. So the information is generally up to date. It's just whether or not that information is applicable to your land use review and determination, and it may or may not be.
Thanks, Jason. I think we have time for another couple questions. This next one comes from Levon E. Has there been a case where the council didn't approve a location?
Yeah, there have been a lot of cases. The first iteration of the public convenience or necessity process, only 6 of the PCN requests were actually council made the affirmative findings to support a public convenience or necessity finding. All of the other ones were denied by operation of law because the finding wasn't made within 90 days. So very few of the PCN requests that have been submitted for council consideration to date have actually gotten the necessary finding for us to accept the application. For the first iteration, DCR wasn't able to even look at a record until the determination was made. So one of the PCN records that was deemed approved by the council ultimately didn't meet the requirements upon land use review. So we did amend the process so that DCR could do the pre-application review to see if the location was even compliant before the request was forwarded to council for further consideration. So of all of the PCN records that were started last August, ultimately only 9 of them got moved forward for council consideration. And, at this time, we're still within that 90-day council consideration period. So I don't know how many of them from this iteration may actually have the necessary findings to submit an actual application.
Last question from Jeffrey M. How will we be notified if of a complete application? Sorry about that.
So the applicant and owners of the applicant will receive an electronic notification letting them know that the application has been deemed complete. And then for the council office, the neighborhood council, business improvement district, if applicable, they'll get an email notice generally within 10 days of us sending the notice to the applicant. For retail storefront applications, mailed notice has to be provided at least 20 days in advance of the community meeting and the public hearing. And then we do post a notice on our website. So there's a lot of notice that goes out depending on the type of record and the activities associated with the record and what we're required by code to provide. But applicants will get bombarded with information, and then stakeholders will get the information as required by code. And again, we do post notice for complete applications for the retail storefront activity on our website. So folks are always welcome to go to the website to see what has been deemed complete.
I'm going to try to ask you one more and then we'll end. From Jim T. What if our state license expires before the city holds its commission hearing?
If you don't have an active state license, you're not able to operate. So you need both a local license and a state license to lawfully operate. And if you operate without a corresponding state license, you're subject to local enforcement and state enforcement for unlicensed commercial cannabis activity.
Thanks so much, Jason.
My pleasure. And I look forward to answering any additional questions at the next Q&A.